There's this moment super early on in the launch trailer when the player character positions a black and white photo of a battery at an angle so that the battery falls out of the photo and lands on the ground. As soon as I saw that in the launch trailer, I thought, oh, this game is something different. It's kind of like I was the monkeys at the zoo when people do magic tricks to the monkey. So as soon as that happened, I was like, okay, all right, I'm ready for this ride. I went in playing this game with no hype around it, just seeing the little snippets that they showed in the trailer and just getting this feeling of, okay, we are playing with looking at a three-dimensional world and you're going to be placing 2D objects onto it. There's a kind of assumption about the physics of those objects when they interact with that world, and then we're just going to play with that rule set. This is one of the wonders of video games where you get to enter into complete nonsensical spaces that break physics, do something entirely different than what could be possible. It's sort of the luxury of programming is they can have the rules of math. Mathematics is about all worlds, whereas physics is about only the possible ones. And so something so fun about playing with these video games is they get to toy with, well, what if we just follow the rules of this math problem and just have it be consistent with a curved space or with 2D, 3D interlocking and interlacing in various ways. There's been a few games that do this. There's been Superliminal, there's been Maquette, and really, in my mind, begins with something like Portal. We're just having this little teleportation system where you're thinking of yourself in terms of falling through a space instantaneously and emerging somewhere else, and then what does that do to momentum? What does that do with problem solving? And you needing to think completely outside of what you're used to. That's just a fun space to be in. It's the same fun benefit that virtual reality offers where you get to feel like you're in a completely different body. When you play these kinds of games, you feel like, okay, I'm entering a new kind of logic, and the problem solving skills that I've built up of all of these years of expectations growing up around a very set real world physics, I now get to truly play with the alternative, imaginative dream logic of whatever new version of physics that's there. Viewfinder was that for me. It is different than what I expected. Watching the trailer, it was back to back, these really unusual puzzle designs. We're cutting through a wall, we're building a bridge in a gap, just constantly playing tricks on you. And what was super surprising to me is actually how slow the game ended up being. It's a much calmer, story-driven puzzle experience than what I had anticipated. My playing of Viewfinder was my first initiation into a lot of these visual tricks with three-dimensional space because I had not played Superliminal. So much of what felt so fresh about Viewfinder for me were actually building off of a game that had already come before. Not directly building off, I don't think the developers at all were trying to make something like Superliminal. It just so happened to be the case that both of these games push the edge of what can be done with these types of visual tricks and playing with perspective. So then I went and played through Superliminal, and it actually put Viewfinder in a totally different kind of context for me. It switched, one could say, the perspective that I had around it, because now I was thinking of it in terms of, oh, both of these developers are experimenting with the same non-Euclidean concepts of taking what you see and literalizing it in a way past what actually occurs in life. And they were doing it in completely different ways. Even though I ended up finding Superliminal to be a much tighter experience, it has actually made me appreciate Viewfinder for what it seems like it's actually going for, which is much calmer, much more story focused, much more character oriented, much more personal in the message it was trying to communicate. I'm going to be talking with my brother about this, but our experience of Viewfinder is actually framed a little bit differently, and how fitting that we're talking about frames with looking at this game, because this game is all about perspective. One of the biggest differences in terms of our experience of this game is my brother played Superliminal first and had already seen so many of the variations on what you do with these kinds of things. In this video, you're going to hear two brothers kind of compare their perspectives on this game all about perspective. One thing that surprised me a bit was how easy the game ended up being. It has such a creative mechanic. It really bends what you're used to having to do with maneuvering through a space, but the puzzles throughout the whole game are so straightforward. The game is trying to just get you to move on, and the mechanic is so powerful that you really can just cheese your way through a lot of these challenges. It is probably one of the biggest differences from Superliminal. In some ways, I felt like Superliminal was less of a puzzle game, weirdly, because it felt more like a point-and-click adventure where I was just wandering around trying to figure out the trick, the big party trick that they had been setting up, and it's really just about trying to find which objects to click on. Whereas Viewfinder was very straightforward about what you can use. All the parameters were so clear in Viewfinder, whereas Superliminal was all about discovering the parameters as you go. In one sense, it's less fair in Superliminal, but it also felt much more satisfying because it became a kind of constant ironic humor, almost playing with you. I felt like there was a lot of moments throughout Superliminal where I wanted to laugh at myself because it was sort of making a fool out of your expectations. Taking what you think you know and just constantly, oh, you're gonna expect it to be like this. Well, it's not like that. And Viewfinder wasn't funny in that way. Viewfinder was way more sentimental and much more focused on telling a story and having you have forward progression. And the story in Viewfinder was like big, having to do with the world itself, trying to avoid the world deteriorating into a dystopia of suffering. Superliminal was much more about toying with you, the player, and playing with your expectations and understanding of yourself. But both of them also were very integrated with the idea of perspective and having a difference in perspective. Viewfinder is about the difference in perspective in terms of solving an external problem. You have many different types of people who all come together, and through an act of community, they elevate each other's ideas to a new space that they wouldn't have done by themselves. Superliminal is all about you having a new perspective on yourself, in your own mind, thinking things through. The big structure of Superliminal is that you're essentially doing dream therapy. And throughout the whole game, you're entering into dreams. And the idea is that you broke the rules and you didn't exit the dream properly. And so you created a kind of paradox where you're constantly waking up in different dreams. So it's dreams within dreams within dreams. And this is supposed to be not what the therapist wanted to have happen. It's like, oh no, you're completely upending things. And what I thought was so fun about that in Superliminal is it kind of felt like, oh, this is the fantasy of what so many who feel like the platitudes that therapy can bring are too general and don't apply individually. It's sort of that power fantasy of, oh, I undercut you. You're telling me that all I need to do is take on a new perspective. Well, here's the literalization of what that actually means, because in real life, it isn't just all perspective. Real life has objectivity, and changing the perspective doesn't change everything. And I felt like Superliminal was like this little comment on like, no, let's take what psychologists say, where they say, oh, just change your perspective, and let's literalize it so you can see the absurdity of it. And it felt like a rebelliousness to it. Now that is the experience of Superliminal all the way up into the end, which is this experience of, oh, you're this character going outside and you're outsmarting the psychotherapist and you're not being generalized about. You're actually the exception. In Viewfinder, there's this different thing of, no, you're the one who's piecing together all of these differing perspectives and you're making your way forward so that you can reach this endpoint and save the world through the use of the scientific institution, and everything's going to be safe.
I think there are a couple of things that makes Viewfinder as an overall design much more comforting and stable and predictable than Superliminal. Just generally, I think Superliminal and Viewfinder are taking opposite angles on this thing of sort of optical illusion, because Viewfinder is basically saying, what if what you see is real to an extreme degree? And then Superliminal is constantly showing you, like, what if what you see is just an assumption, and then when you move 2 inches to the left, you realize it's a completely different thing and you were going based off of visual cues rather than evidence. You didn't know yet what you were looking at. Superliminal is much more about optical illusions, and it has so much to work with there of tricking you into expecting one thing when really things are completely different. There's so much space for puzzle solving and surprise and novelty in that idea, whereas Viewfinder kind of naturally has this limitation that makes it more quaint. It's just fundamentally giving you what you expect. It was weird the first time when you saw a photo become real, but it's not weird anymore. And it's going to continue to be that way for the rest of the game, except for one level. There's like one level that's kind of like Superliminal. For the most part, it's about actually confirming your expectations and weirdly coming to similar conclusions narratively that Superliminal does about showing the missed opportunity from seeing only what you expect. I think they both kind of are narratively about that, but they're mechanically opposite. One thing that is utterly amazing and masterful and that I can never get tired of about Viewfinder is how seamless its mechanic always is from start to finish. It does something that is so utterly impossible in the real world, but it makes it seem completely natural. As soon as you do it a few times, it really separates this distinction between your vantage point and what is really there. It really makes you feel like distortions are reality. It plays with that mechanic more easily as a result because it's just fun to see how every single time you put a picture into the world, it works exactly the way you expect it to. It doesn't feel disorienting. It seems like the kind of thing that can make you queasy, like how Portal sometimes gives people motion sickness. They turn this new physical property into something that is so consistent it feels like real life. This playground that gets created then has to be filled with actual puzzles, and the puzzles have to be interesting. The good news is that they are consistently interesting, right? This game could have been filled with repetition. It could have been plagued by an attempt to make a long game that is worth more in terms of people's estimation of how much money it's worth. They could have attempted to give it a longer runtime as a result, but instead they just focused on small ideas that are just thorough explorations of the central concept.
For me, the trick that Viewfinder was constantly offering up of literalizing some of the processing that's happening when we see something. We know that our brains are receiving streams of sensory information from our ears, from touch, from sound, from sight, and integrating, one could say constructing this into a world that we are then existing within. When you look at something that's flat, you infer all of this three-dimensionality to it that isn't there. You're really just seeing something flat. This is a trick that artists are fully aware of, and that's sort of what they learn when they begin to look at the world as an artist. They train themselves to remove a lot of the mental shortcuts, and the artists actually notice, oh no, these are the real colors in this moment. This is how the light's actually hitting this object, different than what you anticipate. That trick that was happening throughout Viewfinder was working for me because it was something that felt totally fresh and new. The thing that was shocking to me about playing Superliminal after Viewfinder was just how constantly surprising it was. And Viewfinder was using the same kind of mechanics, but was constantly satisfying by giving me control. And like you said, there's really only one instance where I didn't feel in control. And even then, you then figure out the rules of how to get control. A staircase will be there and suddenly it won't be, or what looks like a fall is actually a walkway that you can walk across, and then what is an opening is suddenly a wall that you can't walk through and you're stuck. That is the most superliminal part of Viewfinder, is that whole sequence. But even then, they then reveal if you follow this direction, that trick won't happen. So they give you control again and they kind of bring you back into like, no, you're fine. Superliminal is, no, you're not fine. Superliminal is constantly just saying, okay, we're going to give you this pattern and we're just going to keep breaking it again and again. And you just need to laugh at yourself a little bit. They take this phrase of perception is reality and they use it in the totally opposite meaning. In Viewfinder, perception is reality, like what you take a picture of literally exists when you put the picture back into the world. The full three-dimensionality of it is there. And in Superliminal, it's like perception is reality because if you keep assuming it's going to be that way, then it's going to just break. There's a great sequence. I love this. This is like my favorite puzzle in Superliminal, which is later on where you're going through a tiny little T hallway and you have a sign pointing you to where to go. And you look toward a wall and it says dead end and it says stop, don't go this way, like you can't go here. And then you look at the other way and it's taking you back to the opening to enter the hallway again. And it's just looping and you're going back into this hallway again and again. And I was stuck in this spot because I kept looking at the stop wall and I kept thinking, oh, I just need to walk through the stop wall or do something like that. And eventually I figured out that the wall that has the word stop and don't go forward on it is whichever wall you look at first. It doesn't matter. And so what you have to do is look at the sign to tell you which way they want you to go and just look the opposite way so that that wall becomes the stop wall and then you're able to go through the correct one. It's so funny because it's so completely unexpected, but it's all the more unexpected because none of the puzzles prior are like that, where the order in which you look at things makes things exist entirely. So it's like constantly like, yeah, we're just gonna take this perception is reality to a different kind of extreme than what Viewfinder is doing. Viewfinder still gives you control continuously throughout the whole thing. The tone of both is so completely different. Superliminal feels cold and like the joke is at your expense. And Viewfinder feels empathetic and earnest, almost like, no, we have a story we want to tell you. You're part of this story. They have such similar mechanics, but they completely have a different ethos and attitude about how to build the world around those mechanics. And it still leads to this thing about the importance of perspective. Superliminal is internal perspective. How are you seeing the world? Viewfinder is external perspective. How are all of these people bringing a different perspective to the world? And then what does that matter and what do we do with that?
This place that gives you the ability to change the world with photographs is basically just a computer simulation. That's how you start in this world. You hear a voice from everywhere, a voice from the sky that is telling you, she wishes she could be in there with you. She's commenting on all of the things that you're seeing. She has this way of following your movements through this world. And then it's revealed that the whole thing is a simulation. And the purpose of the simulation seems to be finding a solution to climate change. Basically, the simulation is a kind of laboratory in which they can run impossible experiments at impossible speeds, because the advantage of the simulation is that you can consciously perform experiments in that space faster than you could in real life. Your job now is to kind of look at this record of what this handful of scientists has worked on in that space to find out if they found a solution to the civilization under an orange sky that exists just outside of the simulation.
That was a major and important turn in the design and my expectations of what the game is going to be. When the game starts out, it does just seem like this is going to be a series of puzzle boxes, and I am trying to make my way out through the exit of each box, and that's it. You're going through and you're doing the expected, you're solving the puzzles, and you're getting better at just understanding, okay, here's the logic of these rules, and I can continue to set ground for myself by placing images directly in front of me, and that's all I need to do. And at some point, everything starts to glitch, and you get pulled out. And as soon as that happened, I got kind of excited about the story. It's the same excitement I felt in Portal and Portal 2 when you start to break out of the lab, where it just has this feeling of, oh, I'm doing something I'm not supposed to be doing. Maybe it's that same intuition to know about all of existence, this metaphysical craving to answer questions that we can't possibly answer. And in these little video games about totally upending physics, they always kind of tease this notion of, no, all of the rules you're in, there are bigger rules outside of it and you're about to get in touch with it. It gives you that little flavor of, I'm the all-knowing when I get to find out. So the big thing that you learn is that outside of the confines of this experimentation with physics is a world that has succumbed to the consequences of their forebears, of the people who came before. They're living through a climate crisis of some sort. As you said, the sky is orange-red. It's seemingly too late. At some point you can see newspapers on the wall and it says that due to industrial expansion, there is fluctuating rates of oxygen. The issue is not just a climate crisis in terms of too much CO2 in the atmosphere. It's actually running out of oxygen or the ability to breathe. It's a very particular variation on our climate fears. And that does seem like an important variation because I do think it connects to where the story goes. It's really about a fear of suffocation in this new world. It becomes clear now that you, the player, are an archaeologist of an ancient laboratory. This laboratory that was in a simulation. What it ends up leading to is the characters in this laboratory each have a different outlook on what science is for them. What is the purpose of science? One person is just an artist, purely a painter. You have a botanist who orients their designs around inspiration from plants and what plants have done. But you also have engineers and inventors who are much more oriented around, well, how do we solve the root of the problem? There's different ways of dealing with this big issue. And so you are just this person entering this space that's already long past You're not discovering new things about this space, you're just trying to rediscover the knowledge that was lost. Somehow, the end of this long experiment with all of these different characters did not reach the outside world. There is seemingly a rumor or some kind of intel on the outside that suggests that at the end point of this simulation, they've figured out some way to actually resolve the issue with the weather, to actually return the weather to a state where the oxygen levels can be static and uniform and consistent. Your job is to try to discover that. This is totally different than what I expected the game to be. The game based on the trailer was just lots of visual puzzles and tricks. The game became, as I kept playing, much more engaging to me as a storytelling device. A lot of these puzzles having to do with toying with your perception of the world and then using that perception to manipulate the environment. But that whole time, it's really for me about finding ways to discover information about these different characters. It's a bit like what we talked about when we did our Taking Outer Wilds seriously video, where so much of the experience is trying to piece together the information that you're getting in chunks from long dead explorers who came before you. There is this foreboding built into that whatever caused them to leave or whatever caused this thing to fail might be ahead of you too. Maybe there is some disappointment that you're set to experience too, just like they did. So much of my thinking when I was playing early on and for a while was, okay, what is this game trying to make me think about or trying to hint to me about the outcome that's to come? I still ended up somewhat surprised, actually, by the end. We're not talking about the end yet. Nobody panic. But it was certainly enjoyable for me to try to piece together what is each character doing, what is their role, what is their relationship to each other. I'm only getting little bits and pieces here and there. In some ways, it made the game a little bit calmer and a little bit less cerebral in the sense of being like a pure puzzle game. I would compare it to almost like a walking simulator that has puzzles in between the main areas that you're at. And the main areas that you're at are really just to meet the characters and understand them. The game was always guiding me forward. And it's really about looking at the scenery and understanding the space that these characters are in, and then just getting to know who these people are. And that was interesting to me, is the story.
The story seems to have its own separate ambitions in its own right. The ability to separate the story from the gameplay is probably most exemplified by the reveal of what the camera is and why you have it, which is that it was just a birthday present for one of the characters. They gave the engineer, Si Liang, a camera that he can play with. He's very mathematical and he likes working on puzzles in his spare time. The entire nature of this world being filled with puzzles is largely just a character study for this one individual character, more than an exploration of literal climate crisis or any of the concrete stakes of the story. But still, they do manage to use this camera manipulation technique as an interesting visual metaphor for what is going on, because these scientists are all seeing the same problem from different angles. They're kind of clashing with each other at certain points because of that. As you go along and you realize not just the possibilities of this camera mechanic, but also the limitations of it and the risks involved, such as destroying your exit accidentally or destroying various elements of the level that you need. It fits very nicely into this dilemma that seems like it's at the center of this whole project. They can't devote all possible resources to all possible solutions. They have to find a way of prioritizing them, and it's not clear which solution is most likely to work. So it's not clear how do you prioritize the solution that's actually going to work. The non-ideal scenario of actual science, which is that you have to just hope that everybody's creativity in aggregate is the solution, rather than hoping that one scientist is a genius who can figure everything out.
And there's something fundamentally true about the process that's being illustrated by that. It's sort of the mythos of scientific history that we have these geniuses who pop out of their bathroom yelling Eureka with their finger high in the sky. The reality is so much of what science is has nothing to do with individuals determining solutions, but rather individuals nudging information forward through failure. It's by continuous experiments that we learn all the things that don't work, and it's by learning what doesn't work that we get somewhat closer to what does. And it's so much of that building one to the next that allows for eventually someone to discover in the process of a single experiment a eureka moment. But that moment only occurs because of all the countless failures that stops them from looking in the wrong direction. So speaking of perspective, So much of our ability even to aim our viewfinder at the proper area of study is born of all of those who came before who aimed it elsewhere and learned that that was the wrong way to go. These characters are all aiming their viewfinder of study to solve this problem, right? They all have the same goal of like, look, we have this climate issue where the future is going to suffer because of this. And we have to find a solution, but our angle at the world is each completely distinct. We all have our own way of seeing things, and that is a huge benefit. That is precisely the value of diversity of perspective, is it becomes a diversity of where you're looking, what you put your attention onto. By putting your attention onto different spaces, you stumble onto discoveries. This isn't mad genius. It's not the thing of, oh, the artist is the best of the best because the artist happened to come up with a new way of positioning our reality with different shapes and different designs and styles. It's not like the scientist is the best because they're the ones who figured out the exact rules of this engineering. It's not the botanist who's the best because they can organize life forms in new ways and understand the integration of evolutionary history. It's not that any one is the best. It's really contextual. And the context is within certain kinds of problems, each of those angles of looking at things can be useful in different kinds of contexts, but it's not always going to be useful. And that's a pretty important part of the whole thing. Is we're getting these characters who do argue a lot. There's a good chunk of the dialogue that is just them disagreeing about the way forward, but the thing that is important is that the disagreement itself is really what you would hope for. Imagine if all of these people with their different angles of looking at things all came into this space and then just agreed on one way forward. If that one way doesn't work, everything would fail. The fact that they're each disagreeing and going off in their different directions, that is the only chance for success. The camera is actually revealing something really important about this space, and this is something that the character Hiraya, the botanist, realizes. She makes this comment in regards to the plants that she keeps making. She makes the point that they don't die on their own. She makes this comment about there's something wrong with the fact that we're doing all this work in this simulated space, but the simulated space doesn't contain the unexpected. It doesn't contain things that we don't anticipate or plan for because it is simulated by us. It really got me thinking about the ways that any simulation that you create, if it's not as unpredictable as the world, then it is a false copy of the world. Everything that we cannot predict in the world is just showing us the limits of our knowledge. Until we know everything, there will always be a gap between what we can simulate and what actually is real. And so the simulation, to the degree it can be predictable and to the degree it can make sense to us in a simulated way, it's going to be false. It's going to be a lie. And so the camera actually does reveal something, because this camera that they made follows the rules too well. Take a picture of this space. And what it does is it actually takes a copy of the space and completely redoes it in a way that real cameras don't do. Because what you're really telling a camera to do, an actual camera in the real world, is not to take a picture of the space, but just to take a record of the light. But that's not what the camera in the simulation does. The camera in the simulation re-simulates the whole space. And even the copy machines aren't just copying the ink on the image, it's also copying the whole space. The simulation is giving them this illusion of the world that they're supposed to be experimenting for, but the assumption is wrong. The simulation is not accurate. This is potentially the challenge that they've put themselves in, which is they've created a simulation that is too good at making an illusion that you're actually in a copy of the space, but you're not in a copy. It's a false copy. It's a lie. And it's just too good at tricking you.
The way that the simulation takes a very real concept and shows you the result of a misunderstanding of that real concept, namely photography. It does serve as a metaphor for the kind of conflict that keeps coming up between these characters. The most consistent source of conflict is this character named Mirren. She very early on in the game says, "I'm glad that we finally all come together to bring life to my vision." Oh, I mean our vision. She reveals this sort of non-collaborative streak that she has, where she wants all the attention to go to her ideas. This results later on in some other accounts of some arguments with the other members of the team, and further isolation on the part of Mirren. Her idea is the ambitious idea that the main characters of Jesse and the player are suspecting is actually the solution. They're looking for the solution in Mirren's neck of the woods. Because the suspicion is that Mirren has solved the climate crisis with her particular experiments, there's this sense that she is the one true hope of civilization, that if we can find what Mirren was working on, that's how we fix this. And this results in a very melancholy statement on the part of the artificial intelligence cat named Cait, who at one point starts musing about a question. He says, "Is this machine really the solution to all of our problems? And if it is, I wish that for all of our troubles, one simple solution." And then he kind of catches himself and says, "I thought that would sound happy, but it doesn't." Even though he himself has not seen the end result of Mirren's experiments, and at this point in the story, the player hasn't either, there's definitely an ominous tone there that suggests this is not the panacea that we wanted it to be. And that in fact, by hoping that it is a panacea, we are actually being defeatist and overly conservative and assuming that there is only one way forward, which oftentimes is a self-fulfilling prophecy where you ensure that there is only one way forward. You cut off other possibilities and you find that if this one way doesn't work, we have no backup. This artificial intelligence, he expresses a lot of doubts in this way, where he hopes that everything is going to turn out okay, but he keeps implying that this actually doesn't really seem like a reasonable way to solve the problem.
Mirren's way of looking at things, which is revealed through her fixations in terms of how she's trying to go about solving the problem, is one that's very systematic and organized and rigid. You can call it left hemisphered in the sense that it needs to make sense. All the pieces need to come together just right. And there's a kind of purity to that, a kind of scientific purity, a materialist purity where everything is just fully graspable and understandable. It is that dichotomy in her character from the other characters that is the dichotomy of so much of life. There are artists among this group, and so much of what makes artists, at least seemingly, is artists are not only following what makes sense. In fact, sometimes they're actively going off of what feels right regardless of its sense in relation to what came before. For Mirren, she is a character who believes that if it is a physical problem where the weather has changed because of this and this and this, all you need to do is to reverse that and the problem will solve. It's just sort of obvious. Clearly, it has a chain link from one link to the next to the next. All you need to do is just figure out that link and you'll make your way back. And so much of the way that artists think through things is not trying to go back at all. And so what is different about the other kinds of solutions that you're getting is it seems like instead of solving the problem by going back, fixing it by reversing the mistake, some of the other solutions are maybe more about accepting that the mistake has been done and perhaps having some humbleness or sense of futility in that regard, and grasping that we have to make something new, more, perhaps better out of that. It's a different kind of groundedness that can be very uncomfortable for someone who is very scientifically oriented or mathematically oriented or logically oriented, because the very nature of logic is everything is right before you and understandable and graspable. And when it seems graspable, it feels manipulatable. And maybe that's not what life actually is. And Mirren is the inventor of so much of what we interact with in this space. Cait, the AI cat that's always there, is an invention of Mirren. She made him as a record keeper of the space that you're in. And at some point in the game, he explains that the place itself needs to constantly be maintained. It's always breaking down slowly. That's why so much of the simulation you cannot traverse without using the pictures, because really the pictures of the space that you're using to go through it are rebuilding the space because it has become broken over time. Mirren makes mistakes. She had been playing around with the code a bit and ended up stumbling onto these violet walls and violet objects that don't respond to being captured in the same way that everything else does. And that discovery of hers is sort of just this weird break in the rule set, and it seems to be very curious to her in the sense of, I think it gives her hope that you could break rules in other ways. I took that as her kind of getting a little bit too lost in the simulation, because she was getting very excited about the violet walls and like wanting to study them. Wanting to study the simulation thing is kind of missing the point. You're getting so used to this space that maybe you're kind of missing what the real world was at that point. Throughout the whole game, even before you see Mirren kind of slip a little bit too deep into the simulation, You actually notice that a lot of the characters are really making this space home in a more permanent way, and they kind of become very comfortable in this space. And so much of your wandering through the space is reminding you of comfort all the time, and it's very artificial comfort. Little things like the fact that there are solar panels on the roofs of a lot of these buildings, when that's completely unnecessary because it's a simulated sun and the electricity is simulated. It's all there as a kind of familiarity. The fact that you can hear insects and you can hear birds sometimes. You could just hear wildlife, but there aren't any wildlife anywhere. You never see any wildlife. And so all of these sound effects are just there to give a sense of a thriving world to these characters. And again, it's a kind of false familiarity to them. And maybe that's some of the ways that they start to go astray a bit, is they do sort of become lost in the simulation. It becomes like too real for them. It becomes something that they forget what the ultimate goal was. The whole time you're going through this space, there's so much personality, and it really makes it feel different from a lot of other puzzle games. It makes it feel like this is a space about people just as much as the puzzles. There is also an additional character who's actually with you the whole time, and that is this Cait cat. I don't know about you, but I constantly was petting Cait every chance I got. There's no reward for doing this. I think you get an achievement maybe once very early. Cait is almost a flat personality, at least initially. I think my impression is, okay, Cait is like the little AI robot. But over time, there's a kind of fondness that Cait seems to be displaying towards you, of just kind of appreciation that you're there. As if, and I think perhaps it's a little bit of foreshadowing of what you eventually learn. It's as if over time Cait was losing the people that Cait was attached to in this science experiment. And so when you show up, there's even a line from Cait where the cat says to you, you know, I'm so glad that someone is here to appreciate all these memories. You learn as well that Mirren created Cait in order to maintain the place. So much of what Cait is maintaining is the personal within this otherwise simulated realm. All the human things, those are the things that Cait has been attaching to. And so when you're wandering around and Cait is just watching you over and over again, it's almost like the very thing that Cait was designed and oriented around appreciating is you. You, the human, walking through this otherwise simulated space. I think that's a very sweet idea with Cait. There isn't a big twist where Cait's suddenly like undermining everything that you're doing. I kind of thought that might go in that direction because Cait is continuously asking, are you sure you want to go where you're going? Are you sure this is the solution that you want? Sowing doubts in many different ways. But Cait really is just genuinely curious. Are you sure this is what you want? And seems to just be asking questions not for some ulterior motive. In the midst of all this learning about these humans through archaeological evidence of who they were, you also have Cait, this ongoing entity, appreciating things, even though all of these things are in the past.
Since Cait is a different kind of AI than the usual trope that we see in a game like Portal, for example, where, you know, an AI is really your enemy and basically creating a prison of puzzles for you. Because Cait was always designed to care about what other people care about and basically have empathy for beings that it doesn't understand, it extends the same empathy to you throughout. Cait has had an opportunity throughout its experience with these members of the project research team to learn that this big scientific endeavor is not ultimately about finding answers. At every turn, Cait has to accommodate the inefficiencies of human imagination and creativity, which is not linear and not always completely goal-oriented. So Cait always pitches in these ideas that are actually extremely compassionate and humanistic because it really doesn't know any other way. He was always designed to be the kind of being who, while looking like an absurd little cat, says these really melancholy musings that lend this absurd gravity to a silly looking cat face that you want to pet all the time. He kind of becomes a symbol of the ways that this project to solve climate change is ultimately not about creating a specific future, but leading to an open future. That open future does not only save humanity, but it saves Cait, the existence that he has. Cait has a personal investment in the success of this research. He's not merely there to solve a problem, he wants to know why. And he keeps asking you, why are we doing this? Because he, on some level, gets it. He knows that there is something worth protecting about existence itself rather than just the Earth or the climate or any individual object.
The way that Cait is reacting to you and sort of questioning you actually finishing your search makes me wonder if some of the writing for Cait was building into the cat's personality this element of apprehension at you finishing your search, because then you're going to leave. The value that Cait has, the value that the space that Cait is in has, suddenly goes away. Either the people searching through it find what they're looking for, or they don't find what they're looking for. Either way, there is now no use for all of these memories, and Cait's entire purpose of existence is to keep these memories around. And what are memories for, if not for people to view them and appreciate them? You wandering through this space with Cait there, watching you the whole time, just loving that you're there. It seems to be very gratified that someone is doing the proper relationship with these memories of all these spaces and actually appreciating them and seeing them. That notion of memories being held on is a pretty strong theme throughout the whole thing. One of the most obvious images, literally, in the Viewfinder game is that you are aiming at things and taking photos of them and then entering into the photos, much like the purpose of all attempts to take photos or videos of things is to recapture for a period of time so that one can re-experience later in life a single moment. Of course, we're never fully re-experiencing anything that we take a picture of. I can look at all the photos of you and me when we were little kids. I can put onto it a whole layer of meaning that only exists because of who I am after having seen the photo. But of course, the experience in the photo has none of that grander meaning to it. So we're always not quite relating to the memory perfectly. This game, as much as it is obviously a showcase of incredible programming and design, the coding behind the scenes must have been so complex to get everything to work. It also is just very consistently about you looking at the space around you, deciding to create pocket memories of things, and then to re-enter into them. If we take that seriously as a theme, the idea that this game is having you enact memories and retrieval of memories, the game also seems to throw out lots of ways in which memories can take away from the present in certain ways. One of the first ways that they show that is literally anytime you place a photo back into the world, it cuts away what's in the world. You will continuously be cutting away. Every memory that you paste in the forefront of your vision, the viewfinder of your life, you are sacrificing the present for the picture, and now the picture takes prominence. In the case of you in this game, you're putting the pictures of the thing that just happened or something from longer ago in the past, and it's cutting away and eating at the present, carving it out of space. And now the present no longer exists. Now it's in relation to this memory. Further, as the game keeps going, you also get countless examples of the ways that these pictures degrade. When you take pictures of memories and you take copies of those pictures, you can see the degradation in the image quality of those pictures. The more you return to memories, the more you potentially dilute it and kind of remove the reality of it. The memory starts off as a simple story of that moment that you have. But then, of course, every time we're remembering it, we're then putting onto it all of this other experience that then gets attached to the memory. And so the memory itself is deteriorating and really becoming just whatever you're using it for. And now that's the thing that you're latching onto. As the game goes much further along, there is also a literal black hole destruction, where once you take a picture of something, it literally disappears from the world. The only thing you have is the memory. That is very true to life. All of our reflecting self is not the same as our experiencing self. What we were going through when we experience a thing in an instant becomes memory, and in an instant therefore becomes interpreted and changed and defined by us. For me, it became worthwhile the fact that the game was being lighthearted in its presentation, consistent in terms of its story orientation with each of the characters, but also carrying this theme of memory and perhaps memory sacrifice from step to step, moment to moment throughout this space. And of course, the entirety of your goal through this space is to try to hold tight a very particular thing, and that is the world and all of the human beings in it. The reason you're going through the whole simulation is because you believe that at some point, the experimenters who were in this simulated space had potentially found a solution to the climate problem that you're now suffering from. The hope hinges on you finding that solution. One thing that connects back to that notion of images and memories is that so much of why anyone has any angst about the climate changing, fear of why it is a problem, that the world will begin to deteriorate and future generations will not be able to survive, is very much like the reason we take photos in the first place. It is this notion of a belief that there's going to be some future self to appreciate the thing that is now. And when we see our world get worse and worse, we are perceiving a sense that there was something in the past that was good in and of itself and should be cherished and not lost. And that is much the same motivation we have with photos always. And so it's nice that this game is about photographs, and it is also about that climate angst, that feeling of not wanting the world that we cherish so much to become darkened and red and cloudy and lost. This is much of the angst at the core of this game. This leads us to the spoiler ending of this game. You go to Mirren's space. You see her designs, her fixations on the purple wall, and all of the changes in this program, her seemingly inching closer and closer to understanding the simulation that she's now become so obsessed with, and feeling as if she finally has the solution, and she's making sacrifices on this road wherein she's losing the connections with all of those who are with her. By the time that you're reaching her space and you're almost at the end point, it seems that everyone else had begun to leave. Hiraya left first, and then her boyfriend Aharon left. It seems like Mirren was becoming so crazed that she was pushing people away from continuing the experiment. It felt like she had become too myopic in her thinking, that she was now drowning out the other voices, which of course the seeming lesson so far is that those voices are opportunities and perspectives, ways of looking at things differently to solve a problem. You finally find the thing that you've been searching for this whole time, and that is the culmination of all her work, and you discover that it is a complete failure. There is no answer here. It was for nothing, and it feels finite and done. It is an unusual moment because it's sort of this feeling like, okay, this is a very fatalist game. This is a game about failure. You attempting to save the world, to solve problems, and then realizing that sometimes the actual world is not like a puzzle game where all the puzzles are designed with a solution in mind. Sometimes the reality of actual problems in the world is there will not be perfect solutions. Maybe there isn't a way to go back to the memory of things. That seems to be the initial lesson.
It seems that Mirren was always thinking in these terms, looking for a predictable solution to the problem. She knew what she had in mind, and that was the ambition that drove her further and further away from the rest of the team because they had their ideas, and those weren't going to help her solve things the way she saw it. In her way of thinking, she had no choice but to become more and more isolated and just stick to her vision, because in the abstract, her solution is the most elegant and the simplest one. It's the one that attacks the problem directly and just simply puts all the pieces back together and fixes the climate. An analogy for that kind of solution would be like blotting out the sun instead of wearing sunscreen as a way of fixing the issue of skin cancer. You're attacking something at the root for the sake of the elegance rather than allowing for the imperfections of reality. The significance of her failure is made even more clear afterward because as you explore the most recent experiments that they do in the simulation, what you find is that Mirren did eventually give up. After she realized that it truly was a failure, she returned to the fold of the rest of the team. They were able to start coming up with a different solution that was more based on Hiraya's approach, but that had the support of the entire team, including Mirren. They all came together to start working on soil compositions and that kind of thing instead of the weather-changing device. And in the final moments, you find yourself on a barren-looking orange landscape. There's a tree in front of you, and in front of that tree there is a little sapling coming out of the ground. You pick it up, and you leave the simulation. You're able to actually take the results of the experiment and actually hold it up in front of you outside of the simulation, implying that this really is a huge breakthrough. In some ways, it's an ending that doesn't provide all the answers in terms of technical details of what is it that they discovered, why does it work, what exactly was the solution. But it seems metaphorically that the solution was being curious about the minds of your fellow scientists rather than assuming that you have all the answers. letting people discover things that they do not yet know they're going to discover, which is the most important part of science, right? Some of the most important discoveries, penicillin comes to mind, are always coming from a completely different area of interest. An experiment has value that you cannot and should not always try to predict, and keeping that in mind is essential to keeping the spirit of science alive.
In one sense, the ending feels like it's reminding you of another way to look at perspective. There is the obvious perspective of different people with different perspectives, but I think the other kind of perspective they're making us think about are the ways that sometimes we have to take a different perspective on the kind of solution we're even looking for. Mirren was very narrowly focused, and I think you put it nicely. You said she was searching for an elegant solution, a way through that very directly answers the problem in almost like a math problem where it's like this plus this equals this, and it's going to be a direct interchange where one thing is replaced with the other, and it's going to be perfectly fixed. Everything's solved. What's nice to me about the solution that the game actually presents is it is a solution that doesn't fully solve the problem. The problem will persist. There will still be not enough oxygen in the atmosphere, and it's going to be like that for a really long time. People are still going to have to figure out a way to struggle through the problem that they're living with. But what the solution that Haraya finds with the plant through her interest in botany is a solution of long-term, at least we can survive, but it's going to require something from us. Perhaps Mirren's mistake was thinking that the solution to the problem would not require sacrifices or not require adaptation. What's nice about the solution that they present is they sort of remind us that sometimes changes are going to happen in life or in the world, and you're going to have to change with it too. You're not going to find a solution where you go back to who you were before the change. Sometimes the solution that is the only solution left to you is one in which you grow with the problem. Much like the plants are going to have to grow and then suck up CO2 and release oxygen into the atmosphere, and that oxygen will rebalance things over a long enough span of time and over a lot of work with that growth. You yourself have to work through your own growth and actually adapt and change. You have to become resilient in your own kind of way too. Mirren's particular solution had the very common danger of being so narrowly defined that it was easily broken, because all it needed was any kind of deviation from that solution to not be a solution anymore. She had set the parameters of what counts as my solution in much too small of a box.
The ending of Viewfinder specifically reminds me very much of solving climate change by not solving it, which is the idea of we go to other planets and we terraform them. It seems like a perfect example of the kind of thing that Mirren was doing, where it's just the most elegant solution. You simply start over and build up a planet from scratch. But the reality, of course, is that if you prove that you can terraform an entire planet, then you prove that you could have terraformed Earth anyway. It doesn't really feel like the realities are being taken into account so much as the sci-fi logic of it.
Mirren's solution mirrors that very nicely. It is so clean because it's clean on paper. Haraya's solution, the one of using the plants, is more complicated in the sense that it's leaving lots of other problems intact. We still have all the other problems of people on Earth and all the consequences of the climate having changed. None of those go away. It's giving a solution that's really messy and really unsatisfying because of how messy it is. It doesn't look good on paper. But the thing that is so important about that is the reality of solutions. We don't live on paper. We don't get to live in a simulation, which gets to have everything modeled so pristine that it's unlike life. That's that thing that Haraya pointed out. Hey, my plants only die when I make them die. That's not real. The thing that she was starting to become frustrated with about the simulation was it's not including the actual complexity of things. The plants should die. There should be problems still. You don't have a space without problems. What's so wonderful about Haraya as a character by the end is she's also the first person to leave. It felt like she was just realizing, wait a minute, this is all an illusion. This illusion of perfection. It's the same illusion as the person writing down on paper. And how perfect that the game plays with non-Euclidean geometry, because the whole move toward non-Euclidean math is because Euclidean geometry involves straight lines and perfection. You can create all these patterns perfectly on graph paper, and then some of the experiments with non-Euclidean bending of that is to play with, well, what happens when it's not perfect? How do you accommodate those sorts of differences? That next move forward is accounting for the imperfection. Haraya was frustrated that this space was not being real about what solutions really are, and how fitting that her solution was the only solution that actually ended up working, and it was the most imperfect solution of all. If there is a message to Viewfinder, it seems like sometimes we can define our perspective and our way of tackling a problem on the basis of what we think we know. And it is so important to remind ourselves how much what we think we know is very limited by our personal experience. It's not a kumbaya thing of, oh, we need all these different perspectives because everyone is valuable in some magical way. People are valuable in a very practical way. Every person is an accumulation of different experiences. You can look at it scientifically. It's different data that they have access to. By the sheer luck, sheer chance, you have the good fortune of having each individual you interact with be someone capable of delivering you information that you don't have. If you're open to those perspectives, that opens up the spectrum of opportunity for ways of looking at things and potentially ways of solving problems. And for as long as we're alive, there will be new problems to solve. Thus, it is so important for a kind of diversity of mindset and sight and appreciation of the world. And it feels like that's kind of the lesson by the end of it. We're given a solution that is imperfect by a very specific standard, a very narrow standard, but also very realistic in terms of how solutions actually work. You have to adapt with the solution. You're not going to go back in time. Just like all the memories, they're going to cut away from the present. When you put the photo up, it's going to take away from what's actually there. You, by interacting and finding a solution, you in the seeking of the solution are going to change, and the you that's there at the end is not going to be the same you at the start. What I love so much about the experience of finishing Viewfinder and then kind of taking away that lesson, and then you insisting that I play Superliminal right after, is that I felt like Superliminal, and this is obviously not on purpose, but it is sort of a nice layer to the experience. I felt like Superliminal was taking Mirren's problem. The fact that Mirren was so narrow-minded about how she was trying to solve her problem. And it was illustrating that personal side of perspective. Viewfinder is so much about different people's perspective, different perspectives on how you're defining something, what a solution is. And Superliminal felt like playing with the psychological notion of your perspective being what matters to your emotional well-being. So much of what makes things hard to deal with mentally has to do with the perspective we are taking on that thing. Superliminal is taking very literally that advice of take a different perspective. The whole game is you tumbling through this experience for this Dr. Glenn Pierce, this doctor who, just like Cait in Viewfinder, is this character who I presumed is just a bad person, and there's going to be a big twist where they're totally trying to ruin you. You're thinking, I'm rebelling against them, I'm winning this whole time. But the lesson at the end of Superliminal is fittingly about the ways that sometimes our resistance to taking a different perspective. It can feel like you're being manipulated, like you're being lied to, like, oh, if I take a different perspective, I'm being gaslighted to ignore what's true about this thing. So much of that places you in a liminal space. The reason I think the game Superliminal is called Superliminal is because every space you're going through is not where you want to go. You want to go to a very specific place of, I want to get out of this dream thing. And you're constantly getting deeper and deeper into it. It's in between where you really want to go. That's what Mirren was doing. She was trying to find a solution, and she kept not noticing that she's so fixated on what she thinks is her end goal that she's not missing that there are other kinds of goals. And in Superliminal, you go through the whole thing, and you finally make your way out, and you really have to struggle with seeing things differently in order to make your way out. And Dr. Glenn Pierce pops up and speaks to you, and it turns out that all of what you went through was exactly what the doctor wanted. You were supposed to resist the doctor's advice. You were supposed to turn the struggle to fix yourself into your struggle, not the doctor's. When you think, oh, I'm undercutting the doctor, I'm actually breaking the rules, now it's your adventure for you. And so then by the end, you internalized it, and you actually found the ways that changing perspective is extremely useful, the way through to the other side. By the end of Superliminal, it felt like this is a game about the importance of appreciating perspective. It's also a parody of the opposite point, which is that you can also take perspective too far. It was an absurdist play on taking literally the notion of everything as a matter of perspective to the point that the ground literally falls out from under you. There's that point where you have the chessboard in front of you, and the only way that there is ground is if you put the chess pieces onto the board. I found that so perfectly fitting because that is the other outer limit. There's the one limit of you thinking that nothing is a matter of perspective. Whatever I perceive as the case is the case, and then you're just closed off from alternative perspectives. But then there's the other extreme where you think everything is a matter of perspective and there's no grounding there. And what happens as soon as you think that is there's no grounding there now. You enter a different kind of hell where everything is just completely untethered. And then you have nothing to hold on to. There's nothing to be able to walk forward from. All of your progress and potential is fully wasted under the rubric of, oh, I'm just going to only fall back onto perspectives.
Once you reach that stage where you put the chess pieces on the chessboard and create ground for yourself, that is when the game becomes most optimistic and starts directly communicating its final message most clearly, I think. That is when it sort of shows you that these twists in perspective, which you have been experiencing throughout the entire game, are not always going to be neutral and whimsical, just confusing. It's when you finally reach those chess pieces at the end that you realize, oh, the fact that I do not know for sure that my perspective is lining up with reality means that not only can the ground fall out from under me, but the ground can form under me as well. That it's not just a terrible, hellish existence where everything good can become something bad. The reverse is also true. You can think that you are in a hopeless situation, and really you're on solid ground. Once you've faced that, and you've also faced a similar puzzle right after that, where there's a part of a wall that looks like a doorway, and then you walk up to it and it's not a doorway. And then you see that there's a doorway up to your left, which you can't really reach because you only have a block to use. You realize that you have to place the block on the doorway to reveal that it is a door. That again is similar to that chess solution. These solutions appear in the game kind of back to back as a way of illustrating sometimes your change in perspective means that what you thought was a truly hopeless situation is exactly what you needed. That's the actual therapeutic value of these otherwise neutral discoveries about the ways that perspective can be wrong. And it proves the value of curiosity in trying to find new perspectives. You aren't doing it to prove yourself a fool, you're doing it to prove that in fact sometimes your limitations really are internal, and if you were to understand that, you can actually progress if you're willing to laugh at yourself and say, I thought this was the case, and it truly was the exact opposite, not just slightly different. And it's only if you're willing to truly say that about yourself that you can make the best discoveries that are of the most use to yourself and the people you care about.
Very nicely, both games are therapeutic for different types of pains. Viewfinder can be a therapeutic way of looking at the kinds of problems that we face as a society, and it sure doesn't seem like we're getting any closer to the solution. Perhaps because the solution we have in mind is not imaginative enough. Perhaps we need more creatives, more artists to remind us of a different way of looking at things. And Superliminal is therapeutic about therapy itself. The ways that sometimes the lessons from therapy can give us things that are very uncomfortable to hear and very patronizing, overly simplistic, impersonal, highly generalized. And yet maybe we have to deal with our reactions to that too, to discover where does that truth stem from. And then once we get that, maybe that was the purpose all along, is us making that journey. I'm glad we played both games. I don't think there's anyone taking both of them very seriously, to be honest. I don't think they're games that lend themselves in that direction, but they stumble into some very true things about the nature of problem solving. Because they're a puzzle game, they have to be about problem solving. And as soon as you delve in that direction, well, there's going to be some truths about problem solving that I think are applicable in all sorts of directions. Man, I'm thankful that I played both back to back. I think it was a really nice way to experience them, and I'm glad you got me to do that.